This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Tony. That means a lot to me. And thank you so much for coming, everybody. Can you hear me okay? I see green lights. Okay, sweet. So one of the things that I've most appreciated about being in the Di Tommaso lab and soil and crop sciences more broadly is that there have been so many ideas that we've been able to explore together that really blend ecological perspectives with more agronomic ones. So today I want to talk about a set of research topics that exist really right at that intersection. They have to do with how we're going to deal with the fact that weeds, an omnipresent characteristic of many of our cropping systems, tend to hamper the establishment of flower strips. So I've got a little bit of an introduction to flower strips in relation to weeds, and then I want to spend most of our time here today talking about two field experiments that we've done together having to do with weeds in competition with seeded flowers, and how we can hopefully improve those systems to optimize their function. To get started, just a couple of definitions here. For the sake of this talk, a flower strip is basically synonymous with a wildflower planting or a pollinator planting. Folks use lots of different terms to describe this practice. The fundamental characteristics are that these plantings are established on farms, often in an area near a crop field, or perhaps in a marginal area somewhere in the agroecosystem that's not super profitable for crop production. I'll just mention here that whenever possible, it's good to make sure there's a nice, safe buffer zone between a planted crop field on which insecticides might be sprayed and any sort of a flower strip or conservation enhancements. On the flower strip, the farmer might plant a mixture of hopefully desirable species that will provide floral resources, pollen and nectar, for a variety of beneficial insects, and can also achieve other environmental benefits. So these areas of the agroecosystem are being planted not for harvest, but rather for ecological benefits. That's flower strip. The other key topic here is weed. So for the sake of this work, I'm defining weed really functionally. A weed is a problem plant, something that's probably already present on the farm and really has the potential to interfere with crop production. For example, by competing with crops for resources. It's this intersection between the flower strips and the weeds that's going to be our theme today. First, though, a little bit more context, a little more background about why it might be useful to have a flower strip in the first place. This practice exists to counteract some problems that already happen in agriculture. Agricultural systems, especially our more intensively managed croplands, are often pretty low in biodiversity. Often you have only a few plant species, say a couple of crops, and also a couple of problematic weeds. And that small number of plants doesn't support much biodiversity at higher trophic levels either. Additionally, you sometimes have problems with ecological function. That is, you get low provision of ecosystem services, or the benefits that ecosystems provide to humans. Flower strips can help by increasing biodiversity of the plants, and then consequently at higher trophic levels, and by enhancing the provision of several ecosystem services, notably regulating ecosystem services that are mediated by beneficial insects. Pollination is a great example. That comes from pollinators like bees. Another really good example would be biological control of crop pests. Lots of different organisms can contribute to that, but flower strips may help enhance the abundance of things like predators, which might be able to just eat up some of those crop pests. I've got good news and bad news about flower strips. The good news is that there is a large and awesome ecological literature supporting the existence of these different benefits. This is kind of going to have to be just a trust me, I'm a scientist kind of thing. But yeah, what can I say? But I do have some cited reviews and meta-analyses here, and there are many others. We're pretty sure that these benefits can happen. I said I have bad news too, though, and here it is. Despite the strong scientific backing, this practice really isn't very widely adopted at all. I like this survey article that's cited up here. The authors basically went out and asked a bunch of farmers how they feel about different options for how to pursue ecological intensification. And what they found is that flower strip establishments was ranked pretty close to dead last in terms of its popularity. People are just not fans. And I have never done a quantitative survey like this, but this perspective definitely aligns with what I've heard before. Right? I've, in the last 4 years, asked a bunch of folks what they think about this practice. And usually I get an answer something like, okay, so I care deeply about stewardship. My connection to the land is one of the reasons I'm a farmer. At the same time, margins are slim and time is limited, and I've got to be practical about which environmentally friendly practices I pursue. And this particular one, it's either not super feasible or maybe just doesn't seem worthwhile. It seems like there are other options out there that might give me more bang for my buck. People have slightly different perspectives, of course, but that general idea is something that I've heard over and over again. So I've been thinking about that. Of course, no single practice, not flower strips or anything else, is ever going to make sense on every operation. The whole world is context specific. At the same time, since we do have this large, really neat literature suggesting that flower strips can do important things for us, I think it's worthwhile to try to identify and hopefully reduce some of the barriers to adoption. I've got this list of what I believe to be the major barriers to adoption of this practice. First off, there's money, right? To establish a flower strip, you need some land and you need to buy some things, notably your flower seeds. Now, it is possible to get reimbursement for these expenses. For example, the USDA NRCS has a bunch of really great programs that can help farmers make up, or sometimes more than make up, the costs involved. But getting involved with those programs just exacerbates the second issue there, which is labor requirements. It takes time to set up a flower strip. It takes time to maintain a flower strip. And I think, as anybody who's ever been anywhere near a university knows, it takes time to fill out forms too, or to meet with representatives. And lots of farmers just don't have room for that in their schedule. Now, the third problem here, and the last of the ones that I think are very frequently articulated, has to do with weeds. Weeds are a major constraint on agronomic production in both conventional and organic systems, and nobody's really eager to exacerbate those problems. I'll just quickly add that the two things on the bottom, loss of flexibility and measuring benefits, aren't articulated quite as often, but I'm convinced that they're important as well. So the former is basically an opportunity cost. If you sign something like a 5-year contract with the NRCS, that's a commitment not to plant crops on that land or to apply most pesticides there for quite a while, which might cause some issues if your circumstances were to change in the future. And lastly, flower strips can sometimes be difficult because their benefits emerge at large spatial or temporal scales. Even if you have the world's greatest flower strip, everything is perfect, and you have supported a bunch of pollinators, they're not necessarily going to stick around in one place so that you can count them. So it can be hard to sort of weigh the value of that enhancement against the value of something that's more easily measurable, like your crop yield in a single year. I'm interested in all of these things. And I actually believe that whenever possible, we should try to consider them together as sort of an entire system that needs improvements. That said, today's talk is mostly about weeds. And to a lesser extent, also about labor and management flexibility. One more bit of context, then we'll get into the good stuff. Weed problems in flower strips come in a couple of different flavors. First off, folks often express a concern that it's possible that the planted flowers could invade the crop fields and behave as weeds. Remember, we're defining weed basically functionally as problem plants. This concern makes a ton of sense, but I'm not sure this is something that actually happens that often. I haven't seen a lot of evidence of it in the scientific literature, and anecdotally, I don't hear of a lot of cases in which this actually happens. The major exception is if there turns out to be some weed seed contamination in the flower mix. Like you think you're planting a really lovely group of desirable native perennials, and in fact, you're planting those and also a bunch of something significantly less desirable, like glyphosate-resistant pigweed or something. That's a problem. Moving on to the second two bullet points. These two issues, I think, are a little bit more common. So basically what happens here is that you choose a species mix for your flower strip that's going to be ecologically desirable and not really weedy. But that very non-weediness means that it's not likely to be super competitive against the annual weeds that dominate a lot of our annual cropping systems. Possibly we should have perennial cropping systems. In the meantime, though, that means that the weeds that are already present, like they're coming right up from the seed bank, or maybe they're growing or blowing in from somewhere on your farm, they're going to crowd out the planted flowers you're trying to establish. And in some cases, the flower strip might become a sort of reservoir for the undesirable weeds, like a nice herbicide-free staging ground where the weeds can grow up and set seed and contribute to the weed seed bank and weed problems on your farm in future years. Definitely not the desirable outcome. A lot of my research has been about trying to prevent these two outcomes. Good stuff. So this first of two projects is about perennial flower strips. The second is about annuals. Perennial flower strips composed of species that will last for multiple years, are by far the most common type because ecologically speaking, it's awesome to have perennial plants around. They can build neat root systems and help with things like building organic matter in the soils or erosion control or filtering out of some agrochemical inputs. And in terms of the insect community, you can get a really nice, biodiverse, resilient insect community when you have perennial plants around because there are resources available pretty consistently. However, there's a big drawback, which is this weed issue we've been talking about. Lots of the desirable perennial plants that you might want to use in this context, they're really not very impressive for the first couple of years of their growth. In their initial establishment year, when they're just growing from seeds, they tend to be pretty small. Many of them won't reach the developmental stage they need to bloom to produce flowers for at least 2 to 4 years. So that means that there's an early period when your flower strip is young, when the weeds can basically eat their lunch. And that's where management comes in. So standard recommendations for what to do about this sort of problem say that, first of all, you've got to really focus on site preparation. It's really important that you've got to either choose a non-weedy area, good luck with that on a lot of farms, or do some operations beforehand to try to get your weed population down. This can take a year or more in some cases, which is understandably normally not an appealing prospect to farmers. Depending on exactly what weed control practices are being applied, sometimes it's not environmentally awesome. Then once you've got your relatively weed-free area, you seed your flower strip, and you're supposed to really keep at it with the management. So you'll do things like maybe some responsible use of herbicides, maybe some high mowing, in the worst cases, maybe some hand weeding, really whatever it takes to try to keep that weed pressure as low as possible to give the perennial flowers a chance to gain a foothold. A lot of this equates to large amounts of labor required on the part of the farmer. So my goal with this project is basically to try to understand the competitive dynamic between the weeds and the planted flowers, and to hopefully try to adjust that competitive dynamic so that the planted flower strip is a little bit better able to hold its own against the weeds without the need for so much active management. I think that weeds would be a problem, but that this problem could be ameliorated some if you were to seed your flower strip at a high density, and if you were to use a seed mix composition that contains not just native perennial flowers, but also some native perennial grasses to help take up some more space. Basically, this would be a cultural weed suppression strategy. Lastly, I thought that flower strips would increase the abundance of beneficial insects, even in the presence of a lot of weeds. That is, that some of the flowers would still be able to poke their way through, and that would be enough to have at least some positive benefits. Experimental design. So this is a 2-site, 2-year field experiment. At each site, a randomized complete block design with 4 replicate blocks, 10 plots per block. The 10 plots comprise 8 flower strip treatments and 2 controls that aren't seeded with the flower strip mixture. The 8 flower strip treatments represent all combinations of 2 seed mix compositions and 4 seeding densities. So the 2 seed mix compositions are wildflowers alone, just some native perennial species, we'll call that W, and a combination of native perennial wildflowers and also native perennial grasses. We'll call that G to indicate the inclusion of grasses. The 4 seeding densities are 20, 40, 60, and 80 pure live seeds per square foot, sort of a standard industry range. All 8 of those flower strip treatments also do have an oat nurse crop. The oat nurse crop was added to one of the 2 controls, which we'll call the managed control. The remaining control, the unmanaged control, or UC, was not seeded with anything at all. The other really important point about this experimental design is that it didn't include a lot of weed management at any stage. So site preparation was limited to tillage once and a single glyphosate application, then the seeding. After that, we mostly left the thing alone, aside from a single high mowing with a brush hog in July of the first year. Data collection, lots of data collection, but what I'm presenting today is density and biomass collected in 2 quadrats per plots, July and September of each of the 2 first years, and also sweep net sampling for the insects. Anybody not familiar, sweep net sampling is precisely what it sounds like. Think small child tried to catch a butterfly. Incidentally, my inner child adores this. And we did that about 4 times in the first year, and then about twice in the second. So before we get into any real results, I want to show this picture. So this is one of our 2 field sites in September of the first year, 2022. And where I'm standing is right between blocks, there we go, blocks 2 and 3. So to either side of me, we should have a flower strip and then corn to the outside of that. Raise your hand if you see the beautiful flower meadow. Yeah. So in fairness, a lot of these species wouldn't naturally be flowering yet. But still, in this photograph, you can't even see the area where they should be starting to emerge, because instead what we're looking at is a really dense infestation of foxtails. So these are weedy annual grasses, very common around here and very problematic on a lot of farms. And they grow so much faster than the seeded perennials that the perennials don't necessarily have a lot of access to light down there where they're just trying to crawl around on the floor. Please keep that in mind as we look at these results. So this is density of the seeded plants. For the 4W treatments, we're counting seeded plants that are our native perennial forbs. And then for the 4G treatments, we're counting the native perennial forbs and then also the native perennial grasses that we included in those treatments. We're looking at 2022 and also 2023. What we see is that there is a significant effect of treatments on the density of seeded plants. Specifically, that density is highest in the G60 and the G80 treatments. That is, the ones that have both the grasses and the flowers planted at the highest seeding density. That's pretty consistent with expectations, right? That's what we thought would happen. The picture gets a little bit more complicated, though, when we look at biomass. So here we're looking at biomass across our treatments. That's the columns, and across our 2 field sites. That's the rows. Starting here on this left-hand side in 2022, basically, the biomass is weed biomass. So by non-seeded dicot, these would be mostly our broadleaf weeds, and non-seeded grasses, most of these would be grass weeds, or maybe like some sedge weeds. In Ithaca 2022, our top left quadrant there, we have a combination of non-seeded dicots and non-seeded monocots, largely ragweed and yellow nutsedge, respectively. And then Varna, that's the photograph we just looked at, we have mostly the non-seeded monocots, right? That really dense foxtail infestation. So this is a lot of weed biomass. We wouldn't necessarily expect the seeded plants, our native perennials, to be accumulating a lot of biomass even in the absence of weeds, just because they grow slowly. But they do have a lot of competitive pressure pressing down on them. Then when we move over to 2023, the picture looks a little bit different. So now our native perennials, the ones we seeded, they've come up in 2022, they made it through the winter, and they've got a bit of a head start on the 2023 field season. So they are starting to grow. Most of the seeded dicot biomass that we see in both Ithaca and Varna would be the faster growing of the species in that seed mix. Things like black-eyed Susan, purple coneflower, oxeye sunflower. The more competitive of this non-competitive group. Only in Ithaca, we also see some of the biomass that's in that purple color, which would be our seeded monocots, those native perennial grasses that we tried including in the G treatments. So that's largely Virginia wild rye, a couple of other things as well. But it didn't really show up at all in Varna, because in Varna, those native perennial grasses weren't able to hold their own effectively against the foxtails. The other thing I want to point out is that there's not a significant effect of treatments, that is, our seed mix composition and seeding density, either overall on total biomass or on the biomass just of seeded plants. This shows up most starkly if you look in the bottom right at Varna 2023 biomass. So these are our G60 and G80 treatments, right? The ones that we would expect to perform best. And in fact, they have basically just the weeds. I can tell you why, though it's not a very satisfying expectation. So within each block of this experiment, treatments were randomly assigned to plots. We just did that using a computer program, which was, I understand, to be not fully random, but about as random as we could get. A computer pattern like that is always going to be a little bit less uniform than one that a human would be. And as it happened, That approach led to all of the G60 and G80 plots falling towards the south end of the Varna fields. That was, for whatever reason, the area where the foxtail infestation was actually densest, so the weed pressure was highest. Basically, what this result is telling us is that the effect of a patchiness or a gradient in weed pressure across the fields ended up outweighing the treatment effects. So yes, we seeded the seeded plants. They even came up and emerged and contributed to density of seedlings. But they never really managed to accumulate biomass just because the competition got them. Everybody okay with that? Sweet. So looking just at the biomass data, I was seriously wondering for a while whether these flower strips would have any ecological effects, right? Because there were so many weeds in the picture. But in about July of 2023, it became more obvious that they were doing something, because that's when mostly black-eyed Susans started blooming. A little bit later, we also got blooms of things like purple coneflower, oxeye sunflower, some wild bergamot. Later in the season, some really gorgeous New England aster. And that created a strong visual difference between the plots that were seeded, even the ones that were pretty weedy, and the plots that were not seeded, which, when they had broadleaf plants at all, largely had broadleaf plants like Aldous ragweed, something that is wind-pollinated and doesn't make big, conspicuous floral displays. So during this period of the year, it was visually really pretty obvious which ones were supposed to be flower strips. And that did drive some trends in the insect abundance in 2023. So here on the y-axis, we're looking at bees in the top part, part A, and spiders in the bottom. I do know that spiders aren't insects, just throwing that out there, but I cannot seem to train myself to say beneficial arthropod. Close enough. Sorry, John. On the x-axis, this is the number of individual flowering black-eyed Susan individuals. So the more black-eyed Susan plants you have, the more yellow, the more bees, the more spiders, probably overall, the more insect community complexity and ecological functions that those insects are serving. Overall then, it seems to me like weeds are definitely a problem, and a problem that's not fully solved by changes to the seed mix composition or to the seeding density. The highest density treatments, that high seeding density, did translate into a high density of emerged seedlings, but not necessarily to high biomass production. I also conclude that there is some effect of this flower strip treating on beneficial insect abundance beginning in the second year. To me, this raises kind of interesting questions about what one thinks of as a success. Because here we did achieve unecological effects with very little labor, right? Not a lot of active weed management on the part of the farmer. So in that sense, win. But on the other hand, there are still so many weeds around. Those weeds are going to be completing their life cycles, setting seeds, adding to the seed bank. So this approach might not be the most responsible from the perspective of like preventative weed management. It sort of becomes a matter of one's priorities. So I'm going to leave that there and move on to the second of two projects for today. This one has to do with annual flower strips. Annual flower strips are much less common than perennials because they can't achieve all of the same ecological benefits. Often they do less for soil health, and there can be some tricky things that insects face as well, especially if there's a major disturbance once you get rid of the annual flower strip, like if you choose to till it under. But benefits. Annual flower strips are quick to set up. They maintain the grower's management flexibility, right? You can basically seed something in the spring, get the benefits in the summer, be all done by the fall. And they're competitive against annual weeds to an extent that perennials in their first year just are never going to be. Because less is known about annual flower strips, there hasn't really been any work in this area for field cropping systems of the Northeast. I basically set out to see whether this practice is feasible on farms and whether it achieves its desired benefits, things like increased plant diversity and beneficial insect abundance. I was also really interested in planting time. So the thing is, standard recommendations for flower strip establishments for perennials, nothing much available for annuals, say you want to set these things up in the fall or the spring, around the time of the first fall frost or the last spring frost. Unfortunately, if you're somebody growing long season field crops, think corn, those periods tend to coincide with harvest and planting time, respectively. Basically the worst possible moment to ask somebody to add an additional operation. Just not enough hours in the day. So I wanted to know what would happen if you were to delay the planting of one of these flower strips by about a month, maybe. Say from corn planting time in May into June. Like, would that negate the benefit of the practice because there wouldn't be enough time for things to develop? Or would it still work out okay? Because management feasibility was really the name of the game here, I set this project up as a participatory on-farm study in collaboration with 5 really amazing partner farms. So on each farm, I went out with the farmer and we found 4 pots next to cornfields where we could set up the experiments. 2 of those plots we set up in May within a day or 2 of corn planting, and the other 2 in June. So the May ones we called early, the June ones we called late. 1 of each set became a planting. It was seeded with a 22 species mixture of annual flowers, no grasses here. And the other was left alone as a control. So it was just populated with whatever weeds chose to come up from the seed bank. So this is my favorite part. There was no weed control whatsoever, aside from the initial tillage. No mowing, no herbicides, no nothing. We just left it alone and came back later in July, August, and September to collect vegetation and insect data. So here's some biomass data. It was immediately clear that there is really a big difference between annual and perennial flower plantings in the degree to which they can initially accumulate biomass right in that first year. The annuals grow much more, much faster. So in this graph, the seeded biomass, that's our annual flowers on the y-axis, and the non-seeded, that would be the weeds or whatever is already present on the farm on the x. We do still see a negative relationship indicating some sort of inhibition or competition. Right? Even though our annual flowers, they're pretty good at growing, nothing's as good at growing as a weed. So in our weediest plots, like these over here, we don't get much success with the flower plantings. Conversely, over here, we had some really non-weedy plots that were maintained by a long-term organic grower who'd just been working really hard on a preventative weed management program for a long time. And the flower plantings really took off in his fields. Another interesting finding was that we found a 100% appearance rate of our planted flowers. So we seeded 22 species and we saw 22 species somewhere. That was really exciting to me because in the context of perennial flower strip research, including my own experiments, that's not typically what one would get. Usually you pay for some seeds and for whatever reason, they don't like your sites and they don't seem to show up. So we were pleased to see that everything here actually did successfully contribute to the plant community. That helped drive this finding here, which is basically just telling us that the annual flower strips, they did increase plant diversity relative to what you'd get in just the controls. Oops, there we go. So here we're looking at species richness as an indicator of diversity. You get the same thing if you look at the Shannon index or something like that. And we're looking at the EP, the early planting, having higher diversity than its respective control. Same for the late planting, higher diversity than the control. no difference between the two planting times. That's a positive benefit that we're getting out of seeding these annual flower strips. Here we're looking at a sort of different form of richness. Not the richness of all the plants in the field, but the richness of the ones that were in the flowering stage, that were in bloom at the time of sampling. So in July, not much is flowering yet because we had tilled those plots too recently when we set them up. But by August, we have a bunch of different flower species that are beginning to bloom, especially in the early planted treatments, which has had like June, July, August, 3 months to get going at that point. That's something sort of useful to know, right? Especially from an insect perspective, right? If a bee is flying over those EP plots, it's got some options, and that might be a desirable thing. Forgive the simplification. So by September, this difference between the EP and the LP plots had basically gone away, but we still had higher diversity of available floral resources in the plantings relative to the controls. One more finding here. We do also see a trend in the spider abundance. So spiders, again, are predators. They might be able to help with biocontrol and perhaps serve as indicators of insect community complexity. And what we see is that spider abundance tends to be highest in the EP treatments, that early planting, and it's probably associated with the flowering. You know, spiders are sort of at a higher trophic level, but flowers will increase the abundance of lots of types of insects, including prey insects. Part B is just showing that the spider abundance is positively associated with the number of species that are in the flowering stage at that time. Qualitatively, I think that similar things are probably happening with the lady beetles and with the bees, but I didn't catch a whole lot of either group in the context of this experiment. So the lady beetle and bee data aren't really suitable for statistical analysis. Overall conclusions then, we have pretty strong evidence that the annual flower strips do increase plant diversity and also the abundance of some of these desirable insects, at least the spiders. And regarding planting time, both the early planted and the late planted plots did have benefits, although the early planted one had a bit of an edge in that more of the species included in that treatment were able to flower by August. I think these findings are really interesting and that they raise a bunch of additional questions. One of which is basically that I don't think the question of whether cultural weed control measures can be effective in maintaining flower strips in the context of a very weedy area has been fully resolved. Right? More things could be done to enhance cultural weed suppression for perennial flower strips, like maybe a more vigorous or a multi-species nurse crop might work, higher seeding densities still, successional mixes. There are more things we could try there. Another set of questions I have has to do with the fact that this is one set of research, but elsewhere in my own work, in the DiTomaso Lab's work, in weed science in general, there's a movement towards thinking of weeds not just as our enemies, but as organisms that can have both positive and negative effects at once, right? Towards taking more of a holistic approach. That's a perspective that hasn't yet really been applied to this flower strip research, and I think there might be an interesting intersection there. Moving on more to the annuals. So I see some of these data as a pretty strong demonstration that annual flower strips do have advantages over perennials in weedy places. At the same time, they have drawbacks too. They can't have all the same ecological benefits. It would be useful to develop some materials or resources to help folks think through that cost-benefit analysis. And more broadly, there is a lot of room for extension and outreach to be done here. So that is it. Thank you so much for listening. I gratefully acknowledge funding support from the Atkinson Center and seed donations from Ernst. The annual flower strip project would not have been possible without our generous farmer collaborators. Beyond that, here at Cornell, I have received amazing advice and guidance from many members of the agroecology group at Cornell, also the plant interaction group. My advisors, Dr. Alan Taylor, John Losey, and Tony DiTomaso, have been invaluable supports throughout this whole process. I've really loved collaborating with all members of their respective programs. This work in particular owes so much to the guidance of Scott Morris, plant identifier extraordinaire, who was out there identifying the plants for pretty much every day of this project. Other folks who were out there, all of this work was done with a really great team of undergraduate lab members and research assistants. That's those names in blue. These are the folks with whom I've worked most closely during my time at Cornell. I see that some are listening. You are all truly incredible scientists, and it has been such a huge privilege to work with you. Aside from that, friends, family, cats, I have had a lot of support, and I am so grateful. I don't know how I did for time, but if time permits, I'd love to take a question or two. Please.
Great talk. Just a general question about the species mix that you have for flower strips. Do you recommend more native species? Is there a certain mixture of species that I would have, and how portable is the mix that you use here?
Definitely. These are really good questions. So are ceiling mics on? Okay. So asking about species mixtures, it's definitely a good thing to use species that are native whenever possible. By native, often we're talking about native to the Northeast. So it doesn't need to be quite New York specific, but all of North America is a little bit too big. It's good to have functional diversity in a species mixture. So not just a greater number of species, but species that might grow at different rates, that might be morphologically or phenologically different, and that might provide different sorts of floral resources or different ecological benefits to support different organisms. Some species mixtures are harder to find than others. Like, it's pretty easy to find a mixture of native perennial species that will do really great on a lovely, wonderful soil that would be perfect for crop production, and yet somehow magically has no crops on it and also has no weeds. That's an easy ask. But sometimes when we start trying to put these flower strips into weedy areas, the subject of today's talk, or areas with more marginal soils maybe, it can be trickier, and you might need to end up adding some species that are from a little bit further away, or maybe are a little bit less competitive, or otherwise have some drawback in order to create a full and abundant stand. Annuals are also very hard because there aren't a lot of native annuals that are ecologically beneficial and non-weedy and from the Northeast. We looked and looked, and I didn't really succeed in finding a fully native species mixture for that. So there was definitely some cheating and some importation of species that actually come from elsewhere in North America in that project.
And then there's a question on.
Wonderful. Dominic, please.
Yeah. Did you actually look at, or maybe you have some insights into the effect on beneficial arthropods and pests in the adjacent crops rather than the responsive cells? Because either of those may be more mobile than others. We might have increasing or reducing pest pressure and maybe
Definitely. This is the DiTomaso Lab's next project. So shameless plug for our upcoming Hatch work, which is going to focus on this question of how the management of a field margin affects things happening, including beneficial insect abundance, maybe pest insect abundance, maybe weed abundance within the crop fields. These two projects, they weren't really at the right scale for that because the flower strips were pretty small, right? I was using 3 by 5 meter plots in the first one or 5 by 10 meter plots in the second one. And that's not really the right size to take adjacent crop measurements. It's not even the perfect size for insect sampling within the flower strip plots. It was sort of just the space that we had available. It's a really good question.
Peter is asking if you have any information or thoughts on co-planting annual and perennial weeds, flowers.
Flowers, weeds? Yeah, thank you so much for coming, Peter. And this is a really good question. So there's some exciting work that's being done largely in Europe on this topic, or on similar themes. There's a lot of value in creating some of this diversity in life cycle within the flower strip. Sometimes it does end up creating some management difficulties. For example, if an annual flower that you pick is too competitive, it might simply win the competitive battle early on. Also, if it grows too quickly, that limits to the extent to which you can use certain weed management tactics that are commonly used in perennial flower strips. Like high mowing is really relying on the fact that there should be a height differential between annual weeds and perennial flowers. Another thing that people sometimes try, not so much for weed management, but for broadening ecological benefits, is basically a rolling composite strategy in which you plant different annual or biennial or perennial flower strips at different times. And so you plant some in year 1 and plant some more in year 2 and plant some more in year 3, by which point you might eventually be ready to renovate the ones from year 1. The goal there is basically to make sure that there will always be some resources available for beneficial insects, and that you won't end up just trying to kill any organisms that are overwintering in your area. Yep, Vipin.
Sophie, great work. Just a defense question for you.
Oh gosh.
So based on your research, in your future job, how you will convince Canadian growers, especially corn producers, to adopt flower strips?
Oh, there's an ask, Vipin. Yeah, I think that's a really, really important question. I think that as scientists, we have to be able to provide data that are quantitative, but also relevant to the sites at which people are working. So right now, when I said the scientific literature is really strong, it is, but it's also from Europe, and it doesn't look exactly like Kansas corn cropping systems. So I think being able to do the work in the place, creating things like demonstration plots or videos or other more modern communication techniques, but whatever it takes to show folks that this practice is actually feasible and hopefully worthwhile in sites that are as representative as possible as the farmer's own operations. That's part of the story. The other part of the story, I think, probably has to do some with valuation of ecosystem services. This is a big and old area of scientific research. There has been a whole lot of brilliant work that's been done, but it remains difficult, largely because of that thing with the scales, right? It's really, really hard to tell somebody, hey, so this many flowers is going to equate to this many beneficial predators, and that's going to make you $46 per this area of land. That's something that we still can't do, really, with any degree of year-to-year reliability. I am hopeful that emerging technologies, which enable us to collect so much data and integrate it in ways that we haven't ever been able to before, may help folks make some headway on this question. But I don't know. I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Well, let's thank Sophie.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.